All right. Final seconds is loading.
Let me put this on.
All right, JeRod. I don't see your video, but I know you're there.
All right.
Perfect.
Let me know when we're ready.
We're ready. Let's start. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the discussion. This is episode seven about race in America. We have two guests joining us this evening. First, JeRod, welcome, as always. My co-host JeRod there. And then we have two special guests. First, we're going to, Deb Heater, if you want to introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Deb Heater. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion.
Yes, ma'am.
I know Maurice the longest, but I hope to get to know you other guys more in the future because we share a passion about social issues. I guess I'm supposed to tell you a little bit about myself.
That is correct.
Okay. So I really always had a passion for, as I say, social justice. Everything I've done it because I thought it had community impact. I used to work for the division of the city manager's office, the Office of Municipal Investigations, and we used to investigate allegations of misconduct and excessive force against the Cincinnati Police Department. I spent many years with CCY, and as you know, Maurice, I continue to mourn
Right.
the fact that it doesn't exist anymore. I worked in education at Cincinnati Public for about a decade. I worked in higher ed, and I currently work for the Ohio Civil Rights Commission. I also have a consulting business, and a lot of that focus is on DEI. So my day job deals with compliance and enforcement. And the other things I do deals with getting people to be aware of the unconscious way we do things. Because, you know, Maurice, and I'm sorry, you know, I've always said that whether it's conscious or unconscious, the damage done is the same. So,
Exactly.
yeah.
Thank you, Deb. And our next guest, we have Sherman Bradley. Tell us a little bit about you, Sherman. Welcome.
Welcome. Good evening. Thank you for having me again as well.
Yes.
I am a native of Cincinnati. I pastor along with my wife, who leads our church called The Warehouse, where transformation begins. We're at 1310 Race Street, taking over a building right across from Washington Park. We were officially going to open on Easter Sunday, but that was delayed due to COVID-19, so we've had to revert to going online, and quite quickly, frankly. I'm also co-founder of Good Fit, where different is good, where we're tackling the issues of implicit bias and cultural awareness, trying to bring awareness to the divisiveness. You know, our racist policies come from racist ideas. We have to hit those where they are and continue to speak to the powers that be that have opportunities to change these policies and redirect patterns of behavior to things that are going to be more equitable. So that's what, you know, that in the church really keep me busy right now. It's where our passions lie.
Perfect. All right. Well,
I gotta just jump right in, right? We know what's going on today. Arbery, Breonna, more recently Floyd. What do either one of you have to say in regards to the civil unrest in the current state of Black America as it pertains to not even just police brutality, but brutality against our race?
Okay. I obviously don't condone anything that puts people at risk, but I do know that, you know, pain, frustration, the persistence of these issues creates sort of like a pressure cooker. so I do understand where that comes from. But I always believe that we need to appreciate that anger is an emotion that we have a right to have. We need to act strategically and not emotionally, because when we do that, we give people a reason to discount the struggle and what we're actually trying to achieve. So I'll start there in terms of the unrest, since that was the question.
And
So,
okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, you have to let your emotions take their course. You just don't want to be the course that you take. And so we have to be real wise, as Deborah said. We have to be strategic even with how we exude our frustration, our anger, and our disappointment. And we all grieve in different ways, but it can't come to the point where we're committing acts of violence that are sending out a counter message to the message that we actually want to be heard. That's what frustrates me the most. I get the anger. I've got the anger myself. But some of the difficulties is that I was taught very early on how to move from being a concrete thinker to being an abstract thinker, and yet I have relatives that never made that transition, that grew up in that mindset, and everything is about how do I do what I need to do for right now. I can't see tomorrow. Oftentimes I've tried to plan for tomorrow, but so many tyranny of the moment opportunities came about that just didn't allow me to get to that goal that I had set. And at some point, they just seemed to give up setting goals. And they just walked into life with each day as if today was all that they had control over, and didn't really begin to look to the future. And we've got to help people to see the future. We've got to help them to see a better path, and then help them to see the steps that can be taken and walk with them. You can't just put them in a didactic learning model for many of them and throw information at them and then expect them to go out and apply it for themselves. We have to walk with them. And that's one of the beautiful things about the faith that I have, is that our whole faith is built upon us walking with one another, loving our brother as we love ourselves, loving our neighbor as we love ourselves, loving even our enemies, which is as difficult as it is. It is what we saw happen in the 60s with MLK and others. It's what we saw happen with Nelson Mandela in South Africa. It wasn't easy. It's never going to be easy. It's never been promised to be easy. But we've watched transition be worth it for those that are experiencing transition and transformation as it happens, because as difficult as it is to perceive, things are better than what they were 50 years ago. Even if it's minute, there has been some change, and we have to continue with the momentum of change in order to continue to get to that next place that we say we want to be.
Yeah, I think it's important that you mention that. Oftentimes there is this thought in many communities that things are somehow worse. I've even heard that. I'm like, no. There's been incremental improvements. As minute as you say, there's still more to do, and that's the thing to keep in mind. So thank you for saying that. I'm sorry. Let me get JeRod 1 second.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think my counter to that would be, Sherman, when you say, right, the change, even if it has been minute, right, some of these same actions or prejudices that we've seen in the 60s are still occurring today, 70 years later. What would you say to someone who says a peaceful protest or even loving thy enemy is just incomprehensible? That's not going to get the job done. How would you respond to that?
Well, my father told me very early on, one of the hardest things to do is to change somebody else's mind. I'm not after changing my mind. I'm after speaking my truth and living that truth to my very best ability, and it has worked for me. And I could bring others to the table who it's worked for them. And if that is not where you are, then you're going to have, to figure out what is that next step or path for you. And if, we know though, we sitting here with this microphone know that burning down somebody else's building is not changing what it is that we're ultimately after.
Okay. So
chime in there, Deb. I'm sorry.
Well, yeah. In terms of loving our enemy, and I'll always leave the religious perspective to Sherman, given his expertise in that area. I just know that we cannot regulate people's thoughts, but we can absolutely hold them accountable for their actions. And I do believe that the people who just suffer from unconscious bias are the people that I'm best able to influence. The people who are malicious to their core, those are the people we're just going to have to manage by all the other laws that exist. So I think it's a multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted solution. In terms of it being better, I think it is, because when I used to investigate police shootings, and several of them were related to someone's death in custody, we didn't have the benefit of video. You know, I'm probably the elder in this conversation, and so, you know, back then we struggled to prove when things were wrong, but we didn't have the benefit of video. Now, I know video hasn't always resulted in justice, but there's a better opportunity to have it when you have to try to deny what you're seeing with your own eyes. And if it wasn't for video now, I doubt that we would be on a path potentially to some kind of justice. So it's better. But again, good intentions, Maurice, you know my saying, need actionable strategy.
Actionable strategies, which we're going to talk about today. So thank you.
Another follow-up, right? We all talked about the riots, right? So what I want to do is get you all's opinions, and Sherman, you alluded to it a bit earlier about how these riots, burning down someone else's building, isn't necessarily the answer. I recently did a bit of research in the 60s. The riots up north in Detroit, the riots out west in LA led to a massive probe into the police stations or the police's strategies in regards to dealing with people. What would you say to the notion that the civil unrest or the riots will lead to or could possibly lead to a massive reform in policing like it did in the 60s?
One second.
Hold on, real quick, Sean.
I got him.
Right.
I'll unmute him. Go ahead, Sean.
There's always a broader context to what's happening than that moment. So there are people who are on the ground fighting for change in LA and Detroit before the implosion happened. When you think about what happened with Timothy Thomas here in 2001, we were on the ground since these young males from 95, 96 were dying at the hands of the police. Our voices were continuing to speak the truth that we knew, even against all of the opposition that was taking place. And it was
Sherman, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Can you, for people who may not be familiar, can you tell a little bit about Timothy Thomas? Just a little bit.
Well, he was one of, I think, 21 African-American males, if I remember correctly, the number, over the course of about 7 or 8 years that had died in Cincinnati alone at the hands of police officers in a variety of different capacities. And he was the one that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back, as they say, I think is how the phrase goes. And then the uprisings took place in our city. And people were, enough was enough. And it brought about, it was a process that was happening along the way though, but that was perhaps the catalyst that brought in people from all over the world and dignitaries to the city. And the FBI came in, and then the Cincinnati United, Black United Front with Pastor Damon Lynch and Irish Rowley began to put things in place that challenged Cincinnati Police Department and the feds to look at the Cincinnati Police Collaborative. But there were things that were happening in the community, and there were discussions being had with city leaders in the police department before the riots took place, before that last life was taken. And so while the riots can be looked at as something following immediately, being connected to that is not just that in and of itself.
Maurice?
Yes.
I think there's a difference between civil unrest and destruction. I believe that you can have civil unrest, you can have a show of unity and purpose, and when you deny the people who are looking for a reason to change the subject and make it about you. I think the approach is very, very, very different. Very briefly, I have one scene in a movie, I want to digress here, that I absolutely love, and even though I don't watch the movie in total, in Malcolm X, the scene where the gentleman was in the police station, and Malcolm X and his Muslim brothers walked down the streets in their suits, their overcoats, and their hats, and they stood out front, not committing any crimes. And it really made those people nervous. And when they realized they were going to need to let that guy go, when Malcolm pointed his finger and they turned in formation and started walking down the street, that gives me chills every time I watch it, because there is a way to show unity. But we sometimes, mess up the message when we're burning up things. And quite often, some of those things that get burnt up belong to Black folks.
I agree.
Completely agree.
So you all mentioned strategies a bit earlier in regards to how instead of rioting, right, we should think about strategic impact and how we could go about making change. What suggestions would you all have to combat what's been going on or what we've seen over these last several months?
Like I said, I think it's a multifaceted problem that requires a multifaceted approach. There is, first of all, the stain of how our lives are valued in this country. We're sort of expendable, and sometimes we die, but nobody really wants to upend the life of the person who is responsible for our death, and they struggle to sort of see us as the same. And that's part of the history. That 400 years is really not a lot of time. No. And so, so I think regarding, I'll speak to the police department issues real quickly. It's not rocket science, and quite often we really know what we need to do better, but I believe too often there's lip service. We are not screening sufficiently for who ends up on the police department, right? There are some people who join the force because they love the power to oppress. And so they come on the force and they have a different policing model in certain communities versus others. In affluent, mostly white communities, is serve and protect. In poor communities of color, quite often is seek and destroy. And the same officer can behave in two different ways. And why is that? Because he doesn't know in those affluent communities how connected those people are. And he's always mindful, I might be messing with somebody who has connections. And I think the more we vote and get into power and start creating community and connections for people, that's part of the problem. But we need to know who we're putting on this police force. Early warning, we need to make sure that whoever's in charge knows they have to act on early warning. The gentleman in the case with Mr. Floyd, all those complaints against him before, he should not have even been on the force to put his knee on his neck. So people are failing us because they act more in their own political interests.
Deb, real quick, Deb.
I'll let you guys get in.
Yeah, no, can you give us a little bit of background on what early warning is?
I say that one more time.
Can you give us some background on what early warning is?
Yeah, I will tell you that when I worked at OMI, and by the way, I left OMI right before Timothy's death. So I was there, Sherman, for a lot of those other deaths in police custody. And I will tell you all that I had to make a moral decision when I left because it was something I could not abide, because I have to always live in my truth. While I was there, JeRod, we developed a database. It had not existed before. That database in OMI tracked complaints against police officers. And we would give a monthly report to internal affairs in the police department. I really have a belief that in some ways that impacted people who were acting out. Because even though they never admitted that the officers were doing wrong, because these were documented reports that lived, I really believe that the police leadership would call these officers in and say, cut it out.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that you need to document it, but you need to have leadership that has no tolerance for that. And, you know, at one point I even had a proposal to work with police departments, because you really need to know who has an understanding that there's a difference between situational control and exerting power for the sake of power. And I know that people who are monitoring these officers know early on who they're dealing with. And the very first time they act inappropriately, they really need, if somebody cares at all, need to come in and say, cut it out. There's no place for that here. But that takes leadership who has that mindset. So it's about data, JeRod, and it's about acting on it. Because like with this guy now, I don't think it's going to help him that they now know that, what was it, something like 18 former complaints, a previous death. Now, not all complaints mean police officers have done something wrong.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Because I worked for the police before I investigated them. I was a 911 operator before I moved over to OMI to do investigations.
Definitely. And Sherman, I'm sorry, JeRod, I think let me unmute you. Sherman, you want to chime in on that, on your thoughts?
Well, it seems like an elephant, and you got to find which bite that you can take out of it for the roles that you play in society. And I think each of us have to find that role that we can play and then get involved in that sphere of the change. So for me, at the level that I am, being in communities where I've had the opportunity to engage citizens on the front lines whose voices haven't been heard, is finding ways to connect the voices and trying to find ways to connect the voices to those who have power to make decisions that can change policies and programs and procedures that are inequitable and, quite frankly, just racist policies and processes that are not going to allow us to make the transitions that we want to see happen in our culture. When I think about the policing side of things, for instance, I graduated from high school, and Chief Elliot Isaacs is a friend of mine. So the fact that I can have access to him and have a voice with him about what I'm hearing directly on the ground, I take advantage of that. That's a responsibility I give myself to try to connect the dots. When I was running the homeless shelter for 10 years, advocating on the cares of the homeless, they're largely African Americans in the shelter that we were running. So I had to go to city council on a variety of different occasions and continue to offer voice to try to get the kind of policies, processes, and structures in place to better benefit people who are not being heard. Yeah. And I think each one of us have that responsibility, and each one of us can find a place that we can get active and get involved. I think from the top down, though, we've got to do a better job of collectively coming together and looking at how can we create in our own communities opportunities to do wholesale things rather than waiting on the government coming in. Because as we can see, even prior to this current president, we had challenges with the former, and because the system is just not rigged for us. And so there are things that we have to do a better job of coming together, not just us as African Americans, because when you look at the civil rights movement, it used people who were not just us, and they were willing to fund and give resources so that change could happen. And I think, quite frankly, Martin was so good at it, is that was the number one thing that they wanted him to no longer be around for, was because he was willing and capable of galvanizing people and finances in ways that were going to change how they impacted the communities that they were advocating for.
Definitely. Thank you. So I have a question I want to jump in really quickly. In the case of Ahmaud Arbery, there were not police officers that ultimately killed him. One of the gentlemen was a former police officer, and it took a long time before, it's a public outrage is what happened, which caused the grand jury to come down with an indictment for the gentleman and his son. Or maybe I shouldn't refer to as gentleman, but if you could chime in on that. Now, I know we talk a lot about police, and in these three instances, these were definitely instances where the police were involved. But at this time, you had citizens, similar to the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin situation. A citizen taking matters into their own hands was ultimately resulted in the death of another African American male in this instance. If you could speak a little bit about that situation. just share thoughts.
Well, I think again there are people who get the benefit of the doubt in these situations and others who don't. But I do believe that in the situation that you're referring to, the person had a connection to the police. So they were less inclined to act on that because they knew this person, right? And so
Right.
they didn't seem inclined to rush to hold them accountable because they probably have commingled connections. And let's face it, the young man who died, Mr. Arbery, he didn't matter as much as these connections did. So, it's about who has the right to oppress and end the life of who. Because we know for these situations we talk about, had it been the opposite, had it been some Black folks, look, you can't even sell single cigarettes or be alleged to have forged without being at risk of execution.
Right. And in the situation with Mr. Floyd, forgery of they said it was a $20 bill. He bought something with a $20 bill, alleged, right? So, yeah. So, Sherman, thoughts?
Yeah, the fact that we can have citizens, especially in the Deep South, who can carry weapons and be applauded for being vigilantes over speculation. It's like, in that instance, it feels like we haven't made any progress. That just is unfathomable to me. I just can't imagine the justification and the time frame between and the cover up, and now people accusing themselves, and it just doesn't seem like justice is in Georgia right now going to happen without outside influence. The feds have to step in, and there needs to be a probe bigger than just this case on what's happening there. And time will tell whether that's going to actually happen or not.
Sherman, you mentioned earlier in this question I'm posing to you and Deb, racist policies and processes and/or procedures. Throughout both of you all's experience, can you give us an example of a racist policy or process that you've encountered or experienced?
Deb?
That I experienced personally?
It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have went through it, but that you are aware of.
Well, policies sometimes are so permeable or flexible that they can be stiff in some cases and loose in others. I will say to you that another thing I experienced when I investigated police officers was this approach they would have, and I called it the trifecta.
Okay.
When you would arrest someone, you would charge them with disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, and assault on a police officer. And the goal was to have them plead to one because of what they might be facing if potentially convicted of all three. And I can't imagine that prosecutors wouldn't be aware that this was a particular strategy. So again, we're over policed, we're overcharged, and we're over sentenced. So a policy may not be racist on its face, but how it gets applied can be, and that's a constitutional violation.
Exactly. And interesting you say that. I want to mention the if you recall in 2015, the University of Cincinnati police officer Ray Tenzing, the killing of Sam DuBose, and in that situation, the police chief, the UC police chief at that time, had a policy where he had a no-fly zone around the campus. So his officers, what they did was, when he became the chief, he created a no-fly zone. He said anybody that has license plate, lights out, anything, we want to pull it over, so on and so forth. And as Deb said, on his face, it's not racist, but it had a disparate impact because most of the people that were pulled over were African Americans.
They call that the broken window strategy of policing.
Okay.
you stop and charge people for minor crimes with the theory that somehow they won't be around to commit greater crimes.
Right.
It is ridiculous. And the other problem I have, Maurice, around that, and I'm candid to a fault, is that even when we pretend we're about to make these large changes, we choose people who are known to be willing to play nice. They pull out the same people every time, and if they could have done it, it would have been done. So quite often when I was hearing all these sweeping new changes, and they had committees getting together, and you tell me what that meant. You tell me what that changed, because they knew that they needed people who were going to play nice. Anger is not a strategy. And most of these people didn't even care enough about the issue to be angry.
Gotcha. Sherman?
Share the question again.
Yeah. Has there ever been any racist policies or procedures or processes during your work on the ground that you've become aware of?
Well, the thing that happened for me personally was being profiled and being pulled over and having no explanation for it. And you have no real recourse. And just the humiliation of all of what that represents and the dehumanizing of it, the way that you get treated as if you have no rights, and they're just doing their job. So that's what's most personal for me. But when you talk about Sam DuBose, the other side of this, that, maybe not directly answering your question, but when my son came to me and was frustrated because he didn't know it was illegal in Ohio to not have a front license plate on, and he was extremely animated about what is he supposed to do now. When the one gentleman was complying and shot while sitting in his driver's seat, complying with everything, telling them that he has a weapon, simply going to show you as a parent, when you have those experiences and you find yourself at a place where you really can't, you can communicate with your child, but you can't literally actually protect them from the environment that they have to go in and out. And you know that there are practices that are being put in place that are targeting them specifically. It's a very difficult position to have to be in, and one that, if it weren't for being a man who can pray and trust in the faith that I have, that he's protected and he's making wise decisions, then the hopelessness that I can't begin to fathom what that would feel like, and how to walk in that on a day-to-day basis. It's enough all that we deal with apart from that.
With that conversation with your son, it's funny, man, because I was just telling a friend with the recent incident with Floyd and the incident with Ahmaud and Breonna, my son recently came to me, and we were in the car, and he said, "Why do white people keep killing us and we don't kill white people?" And then we had that conversation, and my son is 11. And I'm interested in your response, Sherman, when your son came to you, because I didn't have an answer for him. When my 11-year-old son, and obviously you can't shield children anymore with social media. So I think those are some of the things that moving forward, I know you all do a lot of work in the community. I would be interested in, how do you strategically approach that conversation with minors, right? That's a real conversation that needs to be had with our youth as well. And I can only imagine, I know the anger I feel when I see an image of a white man hovering over top of a black man whose life was with his knee in his neck and his hand in his pocket with a defiant look on his face. So what strategies, with you all both working with diversity and inclusion, would you all recommend, or even thoughts that you could offer to people who are trying to, whether it's working with a coworker, your child, anyone, trying to explain that dynamic or soothe people within that situation?
To the question you were asked, I'm not a dad.
Yeah.
But I think the answer is we do kill white people. I mean, people kill people, and they're but quite often the imbalance in power based on race is what leads to the unwarranted and senseless killing of Black folks who did not deserve it. Police officers are not executioners. They are supposed to apprehend people, but I think that, you know, killing unless it's in self-defense, I mean for real self-defense, not that you pretend it's with self-defense, is something that, you know, we are allowed to do. But I would say that we need to separate the fact that people kill people. And in fact, the statistics would tell you that Black folks kill more Black folks than white.
Let's jump right on that, Deb. Let's jump right on that, because that's been a heavy topic. Let's jump right on that. When people say, oh, there's all this uproar, or there's all these situations and Black people want to get all upset and riot when a Black person is killed by a cop, but you all don't get that mad, or you all don't have that same energy, right? And I'm not saying you, but I'm saying
I get you. No, I know you're not.
Culture, right? Don't have that same energy, right? Keep that same energy when Black people kill Black people. What would be your response to that, Sherm, Deb?
Well, I'm sorry, I'm gonna say this quickly and turn it over to Sherman. Yeah. That's a conversation for another day, because that's not the subject before us now. That may be true, but that's not what we're facing, because there's a difference between inter-race violence, which is real, because, you know, we could say that of any group of people, they tend to kill people in their group. This is about the killing under the color of law, that people are using the law to kill people when that's not their job. And it's about the fact that goes unaccounted for.
So narratives do matter. And I think the number is 92% of all violence against African Americans are by African Americans, but I think it's 84% of all violence against white people is by white people. So the difference isn't that much, but there's only one narrative being spewed to the nation. That is, we are violent and they are not. And if you look at the FBI data, Caucasian people do more, not only violence against women, violence against themselves. They are far more suicidal than any other demographic. There's different categories of violence that they are at the top of ethnically in our nation, but they control the narrative. Okay. Speaking of narrative, it's important that we tell our children that God values every human being the same way, regardless of race, creed, nationality, all of that. And if I cut you, you're gonna bleed red. If I go back 1,000 years and I cut you, you're gonna bleed red. We are one human race. We've allowed this notion of race as a construct to actually be valid when it's not. It is not valid. There is no scientific proof to races. There are multiple ethnicities, but there's only one human race.
Right. But there's a scientific reason why we look different. I mean, in one nonprofit that I was doing DEI work for, the executive director, a white woman, had a young daughter. And so she noticed that her daughter was beginning to notice differences in people, and that her daughter asked her, why are some people brown? And I really do believe that there is a construct around race, but we look the way we do because of the origins in which we had to survive in, right? You know, we have hair that's a particular way because we came from hot climates and we needed to be protected from it. Other people have thin nostrils because they came from colder climates and they don't want to take in all that cold air. There is another way to teach people that we look differently because of our origins and what we needed to survive, not because the color of our skin imbues us with some other evil or superiority.
Yes, and that's the unfortunate narrative that we've been up against for quite some time. And ultimately, at the core of it is that we as humans have an opportunity to love one another and to allow what happens when we are, because it's our genuine disposition. We have to be taught hate. You don't come out the womb hating. And so if our natural disposition is where we will walk and work and live together with one another and create the kind of platforms that are equitable, because it can't just be equality because the playing field's lopsided, but we've got to build equitable processes to try to get to a level playing field. And when we do that, it's only going to happen and be consistent when it's a condition of love. There can't be any other motivating factors for that. I don't want you guilty as a Caucasian person and then jumping into the fray. I want you to understand the commonalities that we have, because your guilt unfortunately has motives that won't last. I would prefer you understand the truth of who we are as a humanity coming together the way that God had designed it, to live harmoniously together, to not have dominion over one another, but to be producers and to be responsible over this earth that we're equally messing up, not just how we treat one another.
And can I just add real quickly to that? We need to take allies wherever we find them and invite them into the struggle. When I do my diversity workshops, you know, I'm sure, without getting in too much detail, sometimes people get upset with me because they feel that I don't do enough, or I try not to upset white folks. Well, that's not why I'm there. I'm there to sort of get a discussion going. I always tell them I don't have the absolute truth, but we have to be safe to have the conversation. And I think that, you know, we can't be part of separating ourselves. The other thing I tell people is that some of the best opportunities I've been given in my career came from somebody who was white. Some of the worst experience I had in terms of being able to survive a situation with someone who's Black. So we can't ever be so simplistic in how we view this thing. But back to Sherman's point, we have to begin to get in positions so that we can control the narrative, or the narrative will control us.
Definitely. So I want to play devil's advocate really quickly. We talk about Black people killing Black people, white people killing people, white people killing white people. So when you look at, you know, for instance, Cincinnati and the many metropolitan areas, you look, majority of the homicides year after year, over 80 to 90% of the homicides are African-American, and many times African-American males. Can you respond to that? In our city, you know, it seems like most of the homicides are from African-American men, or African-Americans in general. Can you respond to that?
Well, I mean, again, it's because of proximity. In most cases, we just tend to be more often around one another.
Right, right. But you know, African Americans make up about 42% of the total persons in Cincinnati, which is not the majority. Yet we're the majority of the homicides. So one may, and I'm not saying I agree with this, but one may argue that, you know, hey, you know, the homicide rate is higher amongst the African American community. What are some reasons you think that is?
I think it's hopelessness. Not having opportunities really feeds into it. I think that there's a chronic stress that we live under because of oppression, racism, and, you know, sometimes hopelessness turns into acting out. And that's my best take on it.
I appreciate that. Yep.
Yeah, I think you've got the personal behavior, and, you know, there's this self-hatred that happens in despair. When as a male, when you can't find a way to adequately provide for yourself, and the ways that you've chosen, you know, leave you with tremendous stress and anxiety, especially that you are not adequately capable of articulating, and most times you're finding other ways to medicate it rather than dealing with it. It just, there's an internal cancer that's brewing that just is difficult for somebody to properly rationalize life. And so we start living an existence that can't be sustained. There are no, you know, 90-year-old Nino Browns. You know, it's not a lifestyle. I know that was an old reference.
Yeah.
Like, who's Nino Brown? I couldn't think of anybody.
I knew it.
10 years. What's The Wire? The show on The Wire. Dude on the Wall. I didn't watch The Wire though. That's fine.
Me either. Me either.
Man, shame on both of y'all. We just shame on both of
I
y'all.
didn't watch The Wire, but it's that, and then there's the systemic side of it. Where are all these guns coming from? We're not manufacturing them. The plants are not in our communities where the violence is happening. How are all these weapons getting in? That can't be overlooked as well. It's not
With
the
you,
answer, but
with
it can't be overlooked.
no, I'm sorry, Sherman. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Sherman.
Go ahead.
With the work that you two do with diversity and inclusion, how do you bridge the gap, specifically in Cincinnati or some of the work that you've done? If you can give examples, what would going to work or bridging that gap look like today, knowing the racial tension that may be in workplaces?
And to add on to that, I'm sorry, and to add on to that, also, how can we, if say a white person is interested in, wanting to be supportive of us during these times, how can we develop allies? What are some things that we can do for that?
I think education, building safe places to have difficult conversations, increasing awareness, because quite often good people just lack awareness of their own biases. We all have them, right? And so, Maurice, I spent 9 hours with somewhere close to 50 different, I don't remember the number, nonprofits, to sort of talk about how you build these systems and what are the tools you can use. Because, people may have good intentions, but if we don't give them the actionable strategies that lead to change, good intentions are just never going to be enough. And I find that they're there if we just bring them together. And it's not a one and done, So I think we just have to keep creating opportunities for that exchange and that very loving conversation. I feel like I'm really good at even talking to white folks about privilege in a way that it's not divisive.
Definitely. Sharon?
Yeah, I concur. I think we have to continue to have the conversations, the tough conversations. We've got to, there's a delicate balance between being palatable and being truth-telling, because truth-telling is not always meant to make you feel good. And so, but you've got to build trust so that when you go to that depth, it can be received. Because ultimately, it's about being, what I like to say, it's about being righteous versus being right. Because you can be right and it not be heard. But when I'm being righteous, is that I'm trying to work with you where you are and still move you to the next place that you can get to, so that we can be united in the front that we're claiming that we want to target together. And that's a delicate dance that you have to be compassionate and empathetic enough to want to do. You've got to believe the better in people than just what you see at face value, because people are frightened. People are frightened of the image that they're going to, or the messaging that's going to come forth from them trying to be honest with you in their ignorance, because many of them know they don't know and they don't understand. Some want to understand, but they're scared of how they're going to be labeled. And so you've got to create an atmosphere where it's less about blame, and it's definitely not about shame, because I can't use your shame. But we can get to a place of empathy, but it's got to be with truth. And we've got to learn how to speak that truth in ways that people can receive it. Because this privilege thing, the people, there's this thing where white advantage is more preferred than white privilege. But if you look up the definitions, the word advantage is inside the word privilege. You can't separate the two. And to attempt to go to white advantage says, you understand what I'm trying to say to you. You just don't like how it feels. You don't want the discomfort. But I've had to walk in discomfort for 400 years, me and my people in this country. And now you want to play over semantics of words and parse the language that, well, I probably shouldn't say that you created, but it's the English language that we all use to define words, and words have meaning and that they have power. And you've got to relinquish. I try to get my Caucasian brothers and sisters to realize you can no longer control the narratives and say that you really understand what's been going on for 400 years in this country.
And the other thing I do is I don't stand before people when I do these workshops and say I have absolute truth. I call it an exploration. And I think that kind of sets the framework for people to be able to talk about things. I also make sure people are sitting in diverse groups, and I give them, tabletop exercises. And the atmosphere is one where people can feel safe to sort of begin to talk about certain things. And I make them aware of things that they never really thought about, like how we consume the news. I do an exercise regarding headlines for Black victims versus headlines for white perpetrators. And quite often, a lot of white folks in the room never really even notice, where we instinctively notice, you know, because we are the ones who somehow are seen as complicit in our own victimization. And yet when white folks commit crimes, the headlines want to find that one little thing about them that might be good. Yeah. You know, like the kid who shot up his family was an excellent student.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, Dr. Maureen Banaji has a wonderful book called The Blind Spot. That can help each and every one of us understand the innate biases that we have and how we can work to address them so that they're not at play. And if each one of us will begin to do that work, we can draw closer to understanding one another and then building upon that.
And I throw out the nonsense we all have, right? I mean, like you say, the universal bias. I always talk about the pancake, no matter how flat, has two sides. Mm-hmm. And I would talk about, if these are the things you can say consistently, you might be the beneficiary of privilege. If you can say some of these things consistently, you may be weaponizing the real existence of racism to cover up your inability or refusal to do what you're supposed to be doing. Because we know people who don't do what they're supposed to do and then claim that they're the victims of racism. And so we have to acknowledge that all of that exists. We just need to figure out whose nonsense we're messing with today. I would say that there's white folks crap, there's Black folks crap. There's men's crap, there's women's crap. The only question is, whose crap are we dealing with in the moment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right.
Well put.
Yeah. Oh, 1 second, JeRod, you're on mute. Sorry. Go ahead.
All right, thank you. A follow-up would be, do you recommend a Black person, approach this tension with one of their white friends, right? Should they speak to them and get perspective, or should they just let it settle on its own? What would you all's recommendation be for that and for the sake of a relationship?
Excellent question. And I want to add on that, you know, many of us have workplaces that we go to that may or may not be as diverse as, you know, there might be instances where, you know, someone wants to ask you some questions and things like that. What kind of adding on to JeRod's question, what are some strategies to be able to kind of deal with that and handle that?
Well, I think I'm hearing a couple of things, because I don't think necessarily I would approach a white person to impose the conversation. But I think if white folks really want to talk about it, I would let them know that they are safe, right? You know,
that's the first thing.
We know who the buttholes are, right? And so we know who those people are, and you just cut them off at their knees, because they're not really there about creating any real connection. But for other people, we have got to start making people feel comfortable enough to maybe ask the hard questions. And I think the work that Sherman and I do, it's got to continue. It's got to be repeated. It's got to be expanded. Because it is through connection and communication that this will get better and better. And that's where we'll find our allies.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I agree. In 2015 and 16, I was being approached by Caucasian male pastors who saw all that was going on in the political arena, and they were frustrated and wanting to know how to communicate with their constituents and how to better understand what was going on in the African-American community. And those are the points, those are the periods where you have to dive in head first. And I had to stretch myself, step out of my comfort zones, because they were in varying places, and some of them found some of the information in the learning process very difficult to receive, and it challenged the relationships at times. But for those that were willing to stick with it, some were even courageous enough to bring me into their pulpits. That's the kind of work that we have to continue to do in whichever sphere that we're in. We've got to take personal ownership and responsibility, and we've got to be willing, as we, you know, in the faith, we've got to be willing to carry the light. We've got to be light bearers. And we've got to move beyond our emotions and our angst and continue to speak the truth and live the truth out.
Yeah. So I do have, and we're going to wrap up here soon. I do have one quick question. Well, someone has a question on the chat box. One person asked, "Why not approach white people? We are approached by them to explain whatever." The person said, I found approaching whites beneficial. If you wait, you may just be waiting."
Well, I guess if you know who you're approaching, that might be perfectly fine. But I would ask to make sure what is your intention, right? If it's just to engage in some kind of conflict and argument with no real possibility of a beneficial outcome, I think you could spend your time better differently. But if it's people that you feel, it's all about relationships, right? You know, when I do the exercise, have you ever heard people say, you know, this about white folks, or this about black folks, or this about gay folks? And we talked about, are they being insensitive, or is the person listening to hearing it being hypersensitive? And I say it really just depends on how well you know those people or what your relationship with them is. So I wouldn't say blanketly don't approach them. I would say decide what your intentions are and good luck.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say don't blanketly approach them either, because the person who's asking that question is extremely gifted at being able to be successful at approaching Caucasian people. And not everybody has that gift and skill and ability, and you can do more harm than good. And so you have to be prepared to engage. And again, motive is always important, but also having some skill at the process as well.
Mm-hmm.
When I did the workshop, it was predominantly white, and so they were there. I would assume many of them were there because they wanted to be.
Right.
And so the atmosphere was right because everything I did was approaching them. I do this work because I want to approach, you know, white folks. I think we were talking about on the job, and so I think that the location, the atmosphere, and the intentions are things that we always have to be mindful of, because we don't make things better if we inadvertently make them worse because we didn't do it the right way at the right time for the right reason.
Certainly. Well. Thank you. It's close to the end here. I know Sherman has another thing starting here shortly.
Actually, not till 8, so
8.
I'm good.
Okay. Well, but JeRod, do you have any last final thought, questions, anything?
This was great. I appreciate you all and your energy for coming, for sure. I definitely want to shout out Sarah and Sadell, I believe, just for giving information as we go through this. Sherman, thank you for giving your energy. Deb, thank you for the work that you all do.
Okay. Can you give us one final thought, Deb? One final thought, Sherman?
Well, for me, we got to keep the conversation going. Yeah, my final thought real quickly is that I will continue to say that the dissolution of CCY was a devastating blow, because what we did is that we reached families systemically wherever their issues were, and we got the young people where we could build initially their work ethic, and they had meaningful things they could do during the summer. We helped people with their literacy. We had juvenile adjudication that was more mindful of restorative justice. I think that we need to somehow do that again, because most of the people I know who are professionals today had their first jobs at CCY.
Me, yep. Go ahead, JeRod. You have a quick thing in response to that? Hey, can you tell people a little bit? I think you mentioned that a little bit earlier. Just remind. So what was CCY really quickly?
Citizens Committee on Youth. It was around for decades. We had more than 150 work locations. We employed between 1,400 and 2,000 low-income youth. Mm-hmm. And we had a godmothers program in rec centers. We did tutoring. We did creative juvenile adjudication. We helped families when there was mental illness. We were a clearinghouse, but we got to families and supported them through the youth. It's a shame that it was dismantled, and it was because someone didn't know how important it was.
So, and Sherman?
There was another book that was mentioned, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell, which is another good book. And this one I just picked up. I haven't finished myself, but what I've started, this is very good. How to Become an Anti-Racist. educating ourselves is so critical in this process, and helping others have resources that they can learn from. And if you're, still online at 8 o'clock, my lovely wife and I will be continuing this conversation as we try to tackle this with our role as pastors, and how we have to communicate to others that are in as what we would call the family of the faith. But I thank you so much for you guys allowing us to have this opportunity. And you can learn more about what we do at goodfit.training as well.
Certainly.
Before we go, one more thing, Maurice. I'm sorry about that.
No.
Tomorrow at 12 p.m., there will be an assembly at Washington Park. There will be, and the reason for this assembly is to get people together so they can heal, to get people together to understand that they are not alone in this healing process and with their frustrations. It's just about peacefully getting people together to rub shoulders with one another, intentionally network as well. So I just want to put that out there tomorrow, 12 o'clock, just an assembly, just so we can get people together and just start healing throughout this process together and collectively. CCY, I miss CCY. I love CCY, by the way. That was very impactful.
That was that. Yes, I had a great, impact in developing me myself. And Sherman, I also want to mention a book that's been very helpful to me during this time, because when I watched the video with Mr. Floyd essentially dying in front of my eyes, that really traumatized me, as well as the Arbery video and learning of the other deaths. So there's this book that I have. Let's see, let me get Racial Healing Handbook.
Oh yeah.
So it has really given me so many strategies and things on how to deal, and how to heal, because I think it's important. I think every time we watch videos, every time we see these things, I think we all suffer a little bit of PTSD. I think it's very traumatic. I mean, to see people that look like you, face those kind of faces, really, really, really tough and difficult. So I will put a link up for this, a link up for the book that Sherman mentioned, and there's been some other folks that have shared links as well to other books as well. But I think learning is very important. Deb and Sherman, they do a great job of facilitating learnings. This was I thought it was a great opportunity to bring them two on to share different ways to deal with race in America, because it's a very polarizing topic, and it's important that we try to forge forward, because we're all going to be here together.
100%. Well said.
Certainly.
Appreciate you all.
All right. Hey,
thank you all for coming.
Thank you all, and then look forward to our next discussion. Thank you all.
Next week.
All right.
Bye-bye.